Hello, and welcome to Meet the Author, a show where we explore the world through the imagination of talented writers. On this show, we will talk with authors from Laurel, Prince George's County, the DMV, and beyond. Our guest author is Mr. Miller Taylor. Mr. Taylor is a native of Mississippi, but has traveled throughout the United States over the years. He decided to settle here in Laurel in the 1980s and wrote a trilogy of books that he would like to share with us now. Let's meet Mr. Taylor. Hi, Mr. Taylor. How are you?
Hi, Christine.
Glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. So we're just going to start talking about you a little bit. I have a couple questions.
All right.
So like we mentioned, you grew up in Mississippi. Tell us about that and what schools you attended.
I grew up in Vicksburg, which sits right on the Mississippi River. I attended a Catholic school for 13 years. It was called St. Mary's School. The school is now closed. Okay. When I finished high school at St. Mary's, I had a 4-year scholarship, so I attended Jackson State University. I had a degree in chemistry from Jackson State.
Okay. And what did you said in chemistry, right?
In chemistry.
Okay. So then you mentioned moving to Upstate New York. And what did you do in Upstate New York?
What happened is Jackson State in the 60s began an exchange program with SUNY Binghamton, State University of New York in Binghamton, in upstate New York. And I took part in that program. So I went up to Binghamton and I wanted to pursue a career in chemistry there. But I think the cold weather, among other things, did not agree with me. I missed being home, and I changed courses. Also at the same time, I think that was around, I think it was 67. At that time, the country was in the middle of the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And in the backdrop, I'm thinking about being drafted to go into the service. So when the semester ended, I went to work and decided that I wanted to do something else.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that what landed you at IBM? That's your next stop?
Yes.
Okay.
Had to find a way to make a living because at that time, the draft was sincere, and it was just a matter of time before I knew that I would be called to serve my country. Mm-hmm. As long as I was in school, of course, I had the exemption.
Okay.
But I did go to work for IBM. I met very nice people in Binghamton. And I settled in there, and I ended up staying in Binghamton a lot longer than I'd anticipated.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned going to Florida, sunny Miami, Florida. So did the weather call you back, work call you back? How did that work out?
It wasn't that the weather called me back, but after several years of living in Binghamton, things changed to the extent that I met an old, I guess I'll call it an old flame.
Okay.
And I relocated to Miami where I got married.
Okay.
I married. Unfortunately, the marriage did not work. And it was time, after a little over a year, it was time to move again.
Okay.
Now, I had friends in the Washington metropolitan area whom I had known earlier, and they indicated, well, why don't you come up here? I'd always been fascinated by the nation's capital. Mm-hmm. So I said, why not? And around the summer of 1979, I did relocate to suburban Maryland.
Okay, so now you're here.
Now I'm here.
And what did you do when you came up here?
Wow, when I came to Maryland, it's hard to believe, but Jimmy Carter was in the White House.
Okay.
Marion Barry was the mayor of Washington. Mm-hmm. And I was available. I was a bachelor. There were women everywhere.
Uh-oh.
But at the same time, I found work. I worked several temporary jobs. But I was also at that point trying to decide what I wanted to do. When I was at Jackson State, my English professor had called me into his office twice and tried to convince me to change my major from chemistry to English literature.
Okay.
After he had read some of my essays. I hadn't really given it any serious thought. But the more I related to what was happening in on the political scene, I started to rethink that.
Okay.
And at some point, I decided I'd always been fascinated by the very idea, the concept of a book. That how can someone sit down and put words on paper like this that can engage a person, to make you read it through? So I started to put some ideas down. But I'll be frank, I didn't know what I was doing.
Okay. Most don't.
I didn't know what I was doing. There were several people that I had met, that I had, that authors I'd started to read that I really enjoyed. One in particular was from my home state, Mississippi, William Faulkner. And there were three others in particular whom I call my big three. Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, and James Baldwin. And I, as I said, started just putting things down.
Okay.
But writing is rewriting. You keep going over and over until you get it right.
Right.
And I didn't really know whether to focus on fiction or nonfiction. So I started with, because of the political situation at the time, I started with nonfiction. And I still remember that first attempt was something called Politics in the American Dream.
Okay.
And I struggled with it, but I found a guy over at the University of Maryland, a professor there who had his own service, and he pointed out to me how important it was to have a strong outline.
Okay.
So we worked on that. And, you know, I threw myself into it. I did everything I thought I needed to do. But the world of publishing is a very challenging, demanding endeavor. And I wasn't getting anywhere. So I met a gentleman who has come to be a good friend of mine, Ron Taylor, and he became my editor, and we tried as hard as we could to find a publisher, but we weren't successful. And I eventually decided maybe I should try fiction. I talked to some people who told me that, you know, Miller, it might be easier to publish fiction than nonfiction. And as a result, I started considering doing some fiction.
Was it with this book or another book?
With this book. What happened was, from the very beginning, I convinced myself I'm not going to make my main character a male.
Okay.
Because if I do, I'm going to have to live with people asking me over and over, is that you? I didn't want to deal with that. So I decided to go with a female character.
Okay, and that's interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So with your travels and with being in DC, do you feel like that has helped you with your writing?
I think so.
How so?
In the sense that the social dynamics of Vicksburg and Jackson, Mississippi are completely different from the social dynamics up in upstate New York, and then down in Miami. I was in Miami for just over a year, but then coming to Washington, D.C., where I met people literally from not only all over the country, but all over the world.
Right.
And interacting with all these people allowed me the chance to develop the story that I really wanted to tell.
Okay. Cool. So you said you didn't get your book published until 2013, so it took some time going through the publishing process and deciding whether you wanted to write fiction or nonfiction.
Right.
So I guess that would be the holdup of why it took a little bit while for you to get it published.
Yes. Also, in terms of developing characters, it is a struggle.
Okay.
Okay, I find that it is, well, it was beneficial for me to sit sometimes and behave as if those characters were flesh and blood, and sit there, and I'd sit there and talk to them.
Okay.
As if they were real people.
Okay. So give us these are your 3 books here, A Lady and Her Man, The More Things Change, and Class Reunion, and Muddy Water. Yes. You mentioned it's a female lead character. So where did the inspiration come from? Aside from, not wanting to write from a man's perspective,
right.
That whole relationship dynamic, and where did that all come from?
It occurred to me, Christine, that by attending a Catholic school in the 50s and 60s in Mississippi, where rigid segregation was the rule of law. Okay, I had practically no interaction with white children as I grew up. But at St. Mary's, all of my teachers were white. They were nuns. Okay. It was a private school. It was a Catholic school. What I didn't understand was that in other parts of the country, Catholic schools, people who attend Catholic schools sometimes are assumed to be better or more fortunate than kids who went to the public school. That was not at all the case when I grew up in Vicksburg. But the idea that that Catholics, were in any way different from, say, the majority of the people who attended school with me who were Protestants, struck me. Now, I wrote the book, and in the beginning of the book, I tried to show the reader what it was like being sitting in a classroom in a Catholic school, as opposed to attending a public school.
Okay.
When I interacted with my schoolmates and my guys I grew up with, they would tell me stories about what they would do sometimes.
Okay.
At the public school they went to, and I found what they told me unbelievable, because if I had done some of the things they did,
right,
I would have been punished not only at school, but I would have been punished again when I got home, because my father was a Baptist preacher.
Okay.
And some people found it strange that my father, who was a Baptist preacher, and of course my mother, why they would send me and of course my siblings to a Catholic school. Well, at that time, the school was, it was private, so what happened was they had the ability, they had the authority to screen who they let into the school and who they kept out. And that was something that I tried to bring out in some of those chapters to show someone what it was like to be educated in a Catholic school.
Right, and I did get that, from reading it. One of the questions I asked you was about, Catholic school and growing up in Mississippi. Yes. So let's start talking about your books a little bit. You wanted to discuss some of the characters. So you have Loretta, which is your main character,
Yes.
and Herschel. And then you wanted to mention a couple of others too. So let's
Yes.
just talk briefly about them, maybe how they came about.
Loretta, I would want to be the composite of some of the female characters, some of the female classmates that I had, people that I grew up with. And it's a matter of Romeo and Juliet was a long time ago. That was William Shakespeare. But the more I thought about it, how much do things really change? When Loretta met Herschel, he was her Romeo. And it reached a point where she couldn't really get along with him, but at the same time, she couldn't stay away from him.
Right.
Okay? They were together, but Herschel was a typical male. Loretta, he really did like Loretta, but Herschel was typical. His interests were not confined to Loretta.
So did you draw any personal?
he played the field. And at some point, Loretta decided she couldn't take it anymore.
Okay.
And she decided to leave and relocate to Chicago.
Now, is any of that personal? Are you inside of Herschel any kind of way?
Well, what happened was the Herschel character is very slightly autobiographical.
Okay.
I put the Wesley character in because the Wesley character, from my perspective, is probably more autobiographical than Herschel.
Interesting.
Yes.
So not the main character, but
Those
in
are
there
the main
somewhere.
characters.
Okay.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the books individually. So the first book is A Lady and Her Man, and that's a big one. And that one's 389 pages. And you begin so I see the kind of struggle almost that you had choosing fiction and nonfiction, because in the beginning of this book, you have an in-depth historical look at Mississippi, like you share that information and the Catholic history.
Yes.
So we did mention that. So you were able to add some of that to your book.
Yes, I did.
Okay. And then you use, this was the part that struck me, some intelligent words that you pulled out in the book. A couple I just wanted to mention were plenipotentiary and Sisyphean.
Sisyphean.
Sisyphean. Okay, so I had to look them up.
Yes.
But you want to explain, why did you use those type of words throughout your book?
I've always felt that the responsibility between the author and the reader, you don't want to look down on the reader. The reader is smart enough to figure out what you're trying to say. You don't want to give the impression that you are leading the reader as to what you're trying to say. The reader will pick it up. And one of the things I liked about Faulkner was his use of big words. What it did, it forces you to go to the dictionary. But in doing that, I think it helps make the reader pay closer attention to what's being written.
Okay. And so it wasn't a lot, it wasn't a lot, but just enough.
But every now and then, I like to put a word there that's going to make the reader sort of scratch his head and say,
and I did.
Okay, good. Okay, good.
So it worked.
Good.
Okay, so just looking at the second book, The More Things Change, you discuss football and desegregation in detail. So where did you draw that knowledge from? Like the Catholic part, it seems like you knew that, but how did you get the knowledge for the football and the desegregation?
Well, at St. Mary's, at the Catholic school, I was always an athletic kid, and the guys I grew up with were just as well. Now, at St. Mary's, we did not have a varsity football team. We did have basketball. I was on the basketball team, but I was not able to play varsity football. So as a result, I played what we call sandlot. We played, I played with the guys who attended public schools, were on the football team, but only outside of school.
Okay.
Now, to this day, I still love football. I think it's the idea of competition. You play to win, but at the same time, it builds friendships. Okay, and it's so competitive. Everybody wants a winning team.
And physical.
And it's physical. And it's physical.
Okay.
Yes.
So you did draw from your own knowledge.
Yes,
in
I
that
did.
Too. Okay.
Yes, I did.
And the desegregation part, because you said that you were growing up during that time. So
It's interesting in Vicksburg that the segregation was so rigid. The school that I went to, St. Mary's, was private. It was a Catholic school. At the same time, on the other side of town, we had the public school that was all black. We had a public white school that was all white, but there was also a private white school. All of this was part of the terrain in Vicksburg. What I wasn't prepared for when I came to upstate New York and started to tell people that I had attended a Catholic school, I was surprised at the reaction that I would get.
really,
Because I found out that I was under the impression that what was common in Vicksburg
it's common everywhere.
was common across the country. That was not the case. I was looked upon as someone who thought I was, because I had attended a Catholic school, that means you must be a snob.
No.
No,
Right.
no. And I had to point out to people who, when they told me how much they paid for tuition at some of the Catholic schools that they were familiar with, I had to remind them that my tuition at St. Mary's was $5 a month.
A big difference, huh?
Mighty big difference.
Right.
My siblings and I, we paid $5 a month, which for my parents was a burden.
Right.
In the 1950s and 1960s, $5 a month for each child, it was a struggle,
Right.
but we did it.
Okay.
We did it.
And so, other things in your book, it seems like you like themes. So I picked out a couple of themes.
Yes.
And another couple of themes I noticed were music and then mythology.
Mythology, yes.
So explain that. Why did you use those, or what does that mean to you?
I've always been fascinated by Greek mythology and how themes to me seem to be repeated from one age down to the other. In book one, one of the scenes that I have is, well, one of the themes, I have Herschel, who went off. I said Loretta went to Chicago. I was wrong. Actually, Herschel went to Chicago. Loretta ended up coming
To this area.
to this area. But Herschel leaves her. Herschel is out of her life for 10 years. She does not hear from him, not even a Christmas card.
Right.
But I arrange for Herschel out of nowhere to come back into her life. 10 years is a long time. I knew
Very
that.
long time.
But I drew that from the story of Ulysses. You go back Greek mythology, when they fought the Trojan War. The Trojan War was fought over Helen of Troy. And on his way back, after fighting the war, Ulysses was away from his wife for 10 long years. So one of the reasons I named the second book, The More Things Change, is that over and over again, in all kinds of literature, it's the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Okay. So how about the music piece?
The music. I have always enjoyed music, and what's interesting is that when I was a kid, our father actually bought a piano. It was a struggle. My father didn't make a lot of money. It was a struggle, but he bought us a piano. So it was there, but I, for whatever reason, never really tried to learn the piano. My sister tried. My sister, well, she did play the piano. But my youngest brother did play the piano. And it had nothing to do with me not liking music, because I always did. But I told my brother at one point, after I'd had time to reflect, that from what I'd learned and how much I enjoyed music, if I could come back in another life, I'd come back as a jazz musician.
Okay.
Because the music that I grew up with back in the 50s and the 60s, you know, the age of Motown, Curtis Mayfield, the Impressions, Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, Lionel Richie. That era of music was so pivotal, and I think so laid the groundwork for what came later.
Okay.
That I now I second guess myself for not learning how to play that piano.
Okay.
And when I was struggling trying to put the story together, sometimes, you know, when I'm not getting anything done, a way of setting the mood was to listen to the songs that Loretta and Herschel would have been listening to if they were real people, the songs that they actually grew up with.
Right.
And what I actually did was I had cassette player, you know, at the long time ago when people had cassette players.
Right.
I went and got a blank tape and I recorded songs that I think they would have listened to. And sometimes I would sit down and I would just start out by listening to that tape. The tape, I think it went on for 90 minutes, hour and a half tape, and I would just play that to get myself in the mood to get started.
You have a Loretta and Herschel mixtape, okay?
Yes.
Sounds good. You have to get that on the market, huh?
Yes.
That's cool. Okay, so when you started writing, just some more background about your writing, did you plan to make a 3-series book, or, because they are different lengths, and one kind of stops, but did you plan on making it a trilogy, or what was your thoughts for that?
Christine, I had no intention of doing a trilogy.
Okay.
When I started this, as I said, I really didn't know. I was stumbling. But the more I got into it, the more sense it made. Okay. When I finished book 1, A Lady and Her Man, I went to Ron and I said, Ron, the story is not over. It's not over. This has to keep going. And shortly after we finally got the first one done, I started on the second book, The More Things Change. And as a result, it didn't take me nearly as long to do the second book as it did the first book, because after all, I'm using the same characters. Loretta and Herschel, of course, were the main characters, but there were other characters in that story that were also pivotal in the development of Loretta. Loretta was struggling. She's in this area. She's trying to make a living. She's trying to raise a daughter who obviously missed her father, and it was a struggle. So that's why I knew that story was not over, and that's why I decided that had to be a second story. So The More Things Change.
And the third one, is that a conclusion, or is it going to continue?
Well, after I finished book 2 and they were still together, I'm thinking maybe there's some things they need to resolve. And what happened is they have to admit that they had a good marriage, but the marriage, still needed to be sustained. Mm-hmm. So Herschel comes up with the idea of let's go home for our 40-year reunion. Mm-hmm. Loretta didn't want to go. Loretta had put her past behind her. Right. She didn't want to go. But he convinces her we need to go. We have issues that we need to deal with.
Okay.
And the truth of the matter is, all families have secrets. And what happens is, in book 3, they will be coming back home. By the way, the name of the town that I created, the fictional town, is called Muddy Water. I called it Muddy Water because Vicksburg sits on the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. People often refer to the Mississippi River as the Big Muddy.
Okay.
So I called the town Muddy Water. So they come home to Muddy Water for a 40-year class reunion. And as I said, when they do get there, they are forced to deal with some family secrets.
Okay.
Okay.
And it's all finished, and they deal with things and
Yes.
wrap it all up.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's good. I like to read that when I've read the 2.
Right.
I need to finish up the trilogy so I can be caught up in Loretta and Herschel's life.
Right.
See
Right.
what they
Well,
resolve.
I'm hoping that you will see both sides, both Loretta's side and Herschel's side.
Okay.
There are 2 sides to it.
Okay. As it always is.
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, a lot of information in your books, great storytelling. So, just thank you for coming in for that. Just want to talk a little bit about how you get a book published. I'd like to share with the viewers about how that works. So now you talked about it being hard to publish. Did you eventually use a traditional publisher, or did you just self-publish?
Ron and I tried very hard to find a traditional publisher, but we could not. So he suggested that we use a service which is self-publishing, and it is it's dependable. It's like a lot of things, Christine. You get what you pay for.
Okay.
And it is basically self-publishing. It is a website, but they have people available that you can call, and you can do, say, a Ford or a Mustang.
Right.
But if you want to, you can do a Jaguar or even a Porsche. Okay? I'm not going to say what I think of mine, but
Not a
in
problem.
any case, we decided to go that route. And as far as you mentioned about the art, well, it seems, Christine, that there's a website now for everything. So he found a website where you put in the right question, and all these possibilities come up.
Okay.
And it's a matter of looking around until you see what is going to fit your work.
Okay.
And as soon as I saw the Bible with the hands, I knew that's what I wanted.
Okay.
And the same thing with the second book. When I saw the leaves, I knew that's what I wanted.
Okay.
And then with the third, with Class Reunion, once I
So
saw
it
that,
looks like a reunion table.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
right. But it was done with a website.
Okay. So you and Ron worked that all out.
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yes.
So I know we mentioned additional books to these, but do you have any plan on writing any other books? Maybe going back to your nonfiction or trying your hand at that?
I think about it, and when I look at the present political climate in this country, I back away.
Okay.
Now, I never say never, Christine. I never say never. But with the climate of the country right now, I'm not inclined to go back to that original manuscript.
Okay.
Okay. One of the members of my book club, after reading book 3, mentioned that reading that last book gave the impression that there might be something between not just Loretta and Herschel, but there might be something between Loretta and Wesley. I had never given that any serious thought, but it did start me
maybe.
thinking. So that I'll call that a maybe.
Okay, so you'll call us back when you decide and you write it. And
Yes.
Fair enough.
Yes.
All right, so again, thank you for being here. We'd like to give you a moment to share your contact information, how someone can purchase your book or get in touch with you.
My email address is mtayl56@yahoo.com. All 3 books are available on Amazon.com. I have put a copy of each book in the Laurel Library.
Okay. Good. So I want to thank you for showing up today and for being able to discuss your books and your life. We really appreciate you being here and hope to hear more from you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. We'll be right back. In his trilogy of books, Miller Taylor brings us a unique perspective of an African-American couple from Mississippi. We meet Loretta and Herschel, who grow up, fall in love, and navigate the waters of life as they handle raising children, religion, and infidelity issues, to name a few. The first book is quite a dense read with almost 400 pages, but the other 2 are less than 200 pages each. So just be prepared to carve out some time to read the trilogy in its entirety and get ready to delve into all they have to offer. Be careful when using big, elaborate words in your books. While it may be clever to you, it could go either way with your reader. It may make them pay close attention and take the time to see what the word means, or it may annoy the heck out of them. However, in the end, it's your book and your niche to carve in this big, big world of authors, books, and writing. I would like to thank Mr. Taylor for joining me today. He is an intelligent man who has used his knowledge, learned in school, travels, and life to bring us a vivid picture of relationships. I appreciate his perspective and look forward to more works from him in the future. If you are an author and would like to be featured on our program, you can send an email to cmjohnson@laurel.md.us or call 301-725-5300, extension 2110. We would love to have you on the show. I'm Christine Johnson, reminding you to open a book and let it take you on your next adventure.